This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 4, Quarterline.
Stop. I can't run anymore.
Eric collapsed against the rough bark of a tree, gasping for air. The muscles in his legs were burning with the ache of overuse. His elbows and knees were scuffed and bleeding from his clumsiness, and he was certain several of his toes were broken. Evan jammed his heels into the dirt, skidding to a stop. He turned to face his friend, sweat dripping from his brow.
"What are you doing? They could be right behind us!"
Eric slid down the trunk of the tree until he hit the ground, heaving in huge lungfuls of air in what felt like an impossible feat to catch his breath.
Your legs are so tiny. How are you so damn fast?
Evan snorted.
"It's easy. Just pretend there's a giant bear chasing you."
He rolled his eyes as he made a gesture with his hands.
"I told you before, this is why you never skip leg day."
Eric offered the tiny merc a flat look.
Funny.
He shifted himself until he was sitting firmly on the ground.
Just help me get these off, and then we can go.
He raised his hands piteously. Evan closed the distance between them and tugged on the loose end of the rope binding his friend.
"You can rest later, when I know we're far enough away from these lunatics."
Eric buckled down on his most pitiful look. Really sell the act, he thought, as he made his lower lip quiver. It wasn't a hard bargain, considering his current state. The tiny merc sighed and eventually caved. There was no resisting those dewy eyes. He cocked an ear, listening for any sign of their pursuers. The forest was silent, save for the occasional call of some high-flying creature or the scurrying of a woodland animal. But every twig that dropped from the canopy rang out like a gunshot in their panicked state. Evan returned his attention to the heavy rope, carefully inspecting it. The knot seemed to twist in on itself over and over with no obvious way to untie it, and there was a faint glimmer of something beneath the thick threads, almost like words. He shrugged a little to himself and drew one of his knives from its holster. He pushed the razor's edge against the rope and began to work it back and forth, sawing into the fibers. It was like trying to cut concrete with a spoon. A twig snapped somewhere in the distance, and he pulled away, looking over his shoulder.
"Well?"
Eric tilted his head, pulling his wrist closer to his face to see how much further they had to go.
"Well, nothing. My blade didn't even leave a scratch."
Evan glanced back and forth, trying to spot any movement in the thick brush.
"Didn't that guy say they were magic?"
Eric dropped his hands, his face falling in exasperation.
"There is no such thing as magic."
Evan clicked his tongue against his teeth, then gestured at the ropes.
"Okay, but my knife didn't even put a dent in that stuff, and it's super sharp."
He swung his arm to the side, slicing a branch clean off the nearest shrubbery to demonstrate his point.
"Besides, what about those zombies? Explain that without magic."
Eric chewed his tongue, listening to the silence of the forest. A moment passed before his brain was able to cobble together a weak argument.
"Okay, clearly there is some sort of parasitic entity inhabiting the neuromusculature system which drives—"
"Hey!"
Evan gestured at him with the tip of his knife.
"What's my rule about nerd talk?"
Eric gave him a disgruntled huff.
"I can't explain it any easier for you."
"Look, let's face it, man. We've been to a desert where monolithic structures were powered by ancient robotic technology. We've swan dived into a day-glow orange peat bog. We even teamed up with a talking skeleton. Can you just accept that perhaps there's stuff in this world that your science can't explain?"
Eric hadn't spent countless years of his life poring over thousands of books, spent every waking hour learning and expanding his knowledge just to be talked into believing in magic. He snatched the blade out of the tiny merc's hands and flipped it in his fingers. He pushed the edge of the knife against the ropes and began sawing at the threads furiously. After several minutes of frantic cutting, the rope still refused to yield to the blade. Eric let out a small cry of frustration and flung the knife deeper into the forest. Evan's eyes narrowed. Really? He heard the telltale thunk of his blade sinking into the soft ground. Not cool, man. You know this is my favorite knife. Your brother gave that to me. Eric sighed and slumped back, his head resting against the tree.
I'm sorry.
He looked up into the canopy.
I hate it here.
Yeah, it was no picnic for me either.
Evan snapped his fingers to get the other man's attention.
We'll get out of here a lot sooner if you stop whining like a little baby. So get up and let's get going.
Eric watched the tiny merc stalk off into the brush in the direction of his lost blade.
I'm not being a baby.
He rolled his eyes and twisted, shoving his bound hands into the dirt to push himself to his feet. Evan ducked into the brush and pulled back a branch. There, glinting off what little sunlight could break through the canopy, was his knife in the middle of what appeared to be a game trail, much smaller than the one the wizard and bear had been following. Evan gave a tiny dance of joy. Following this would not only be easier than forcing their way through the dense forest, it would help cover their tracks. Eric had left behind a trail of broken twigs, disturbed earth, and trampled brush that any half-decent tracker could follow in their sleep. He stepped out, making his way toward the trail. Something nagged at the back of his mind, pulling him to a stop. His subconscious had spotted it before he had. The clutter of debris here looked deliberate. The broken branches and dead leaves on the ground were clearly arranged to look unintentional. Squinting through the debris, Evan pivoted on the spot when he caught the faintest glint of something that didn't belong. There, between a large pile of rocks and stretching across to a rotted stump on the other side of the trail, he could make out the shimmer of a hair-thin metal tripwire. He followed the arc of light off its surface up into the nearest tree, where it disappeared into the thick overgrowth. If there was a trap here, they could be anywhere. He was reeling from the implications of this when something crunched up the path behind him.
What's taking so long? I couldn't have thrown it that far.
Eric spotted the knife a little ways past the tiny merc.
Dude, it's right there. How'd you miss it?
Evan's heart jumped into his throat as the word "stop" tried to escape his lips. But before it made it out, the idiot trampled right through the tension line. The screaming of rope being pulled through the trees by something heavy broke the silence of the forest. There was a moment of stillness, a loud crash, and then a woven net launched into the canopy, snatching them both into the air. Like a panicked animal, Eric cried out and began thrashing around in the net in a futile attempt to break free.
Stop! Stop squirming, you overgrown oaf!
Evan tugged against Eric's brightly colored shirt, trying to force him to remain still. But there was no calming the swinging of the net. With every jostle or jerk of the trap, several bottles clanked loudly together, echoing off the dense forest below.
You trying to get us killed?
Why didn't you say something before I marched into a trap?
Eric twisted, trying to force his body into a more comfortable position.
I said, stop squirming!
Evan cursed under his breath as he felt the net begin to rotate. The bottles somewhere below continued to rattle off one another with every movement they made. He instinctively reached for his knife, then remembered that it was still in the dirt where someone had thrown it. He made to reach for his second belt knife, but it was no use. His arms were trapped against his side.
We have to get out of here before it's fully dark. I don't want to be hanging around as a free meal for hungry scavengers.
He strained his fingers to reach for his emergency blade tucked inside his boot. Evan made several fruitless attempts to grab his knife before giving up. He couldn't remove his foot from the net, and he couldn't reach it from beneath the idiot, who was still squirming despite all the warnings. The net was rotating, spinning the forest around them at nauseating speeds. He was starting to understand Vel's frustration with his brother. The sound of branches cracking halted both their movements. They froze, listening to the way leaves and twigs crumbled beneath a heavy presence. Something big was moving nearby.
Food?
4 massive fingers dug their way through the holes in the net and brought the spinning to a violent stop. Choking down the bile, Evan gazed up into what he had assumed was a pile of rocks. It was less a face and more a combination of lumpy features wrapped in granite. The net had to be at least 11 feet in the air, but this thing was staring at them face to face. It was a pale, chalky white in color, with tiny, angry black eyes. It bared its teeth at them, revealing a row of jagged, flat teeth and 2 very large tusks jutting from its lower jaw.
Food!
Something small, round, and red appeared on the creature's shoulder, extending a long, skinny finger through the net holes to jab Eric in the nose.
Wow! What's this?
Evan followed the finger back to its owner. There, perched atop the monstrous beast, was a tiny imp. There was no other word for it. It had 2 curled horns on its head, a mange of fur around its neck, and had its long, skinny tail wrapped around the other creature's neck. Eric exchanged a look with his tiny traveling companion, his eyes going wide with fear as the thought of becoming this creature's next meal washed over him. He turned back to the beast, shaking his head furiously.
Not food! Not food!
Evan leveled a flat look at Eric.
Now do you believe in magic?
We've lost the western crops, sir. The Dryads hit back hard and the encroaching forest has destroyed our supply route.
General Rossi was a simple orc. All she really wanted in life was a warm, dry place to sleep and food in her belly. She let out a soft string of curses as she glared down at the map spread out over the small makeshift table. Losing the western fields and access to their routes would put a massive dent in their already dwindling food supply.
How am I supposed to feed everyone if the damn nature won't let me?
She threw the bone she had been gnawing on to Drez, her pet hellhound. The beast caught it deftly in its massive jaws and snapped it apart with a single bite. Rossi returned her cold gaze to the grunt standing before her.
Very well. Gather 6 men and burn back the new growth. Do not engage with the local Dryads. Inform me if they return before you are done.
The squat troll snapped to attention, tapping his chest a couple of times with an open palm in salute before departing into the growing darkness of night. The general sighed heavily as she looked around. Her camp was filled with many different species, those deemed unworthy of cohabitating with humans. From the lowly gnolls huddled together at their own fires, to her fellow orcs sharpening their axes, and even a scattering of humans who had fled the law. These were her people, her responsibility. She had been tasked with creating an outpost in the Forest of the Dead by the Bandit Queen herself, a linchpin to galvanizing the bandit tribes that inhabited the outskirts of the forest. By opening a stronghold in the area, the hope was that it would give them resources to expand their meager enterprises under a unified banner. What they hadn't counted on was the land itself fighting back. Rossi was pulled out of her musings when she heard the tremor of approaching feet. She glanced up to see one of her ogres approaching her position, dropping a canvas bag down atop the map in front of her. The makeshift table crumbled under the weight of it, and she looked up at the pale monster and its impish riding companion.
What is this, Akaz? I've told you not to bring me stuff without informing me first.
Brought food.
Rossi pushed her fingers into her forehead, letting out a sigh as she did.
It's true! Found them wandering the Eastern Trail! Thought you'd like!
Akaz hopped from one of the ogre's shoulders to the other, his mouth pulled back in an eager grin. The general gave the imp a dangerous look.
If you've brought me more of those undead, we're going to have a problem. No! Big human and small human!
Akaz licked his lips greedily. Around the camp, Rossi could see many of her men had tuned into their conversation at the mention of fresh meat. Human flesh held no interest for the more intelligent races under her command, but the rest would eat anything with a pulse if it stayed still long enough. Her gaze flickered from the giant, pale ogre to the musty sack squirming at her feet. What would a human and a child be doing out here? She couldn't fight her growing interest as she reached over, undoing the binding around the top of the bag. Eric fell backwards out of the opening, taking in a lungful of air with strained effort.
Oh, God! It smelled so bad in there!
Evan sprang out of the sack, drawing his remaining knife and leaping straight for the nearest target. Rossi stepped back in surprise, and a massive black paw swung through the air, catching the small one mid-jump. It was slammed to the ground where her beloved hellhound kept it pinned. An eyebrow crusted on Rossi's face as she stared down at, indeed, two humanoid creatures. She gave Drez a pat on the head as she looked from the dwarf assassin to the taller of the two. In the flickering firelight, he looked strangely familiar. It was then she noticed that he was bound at the wrist. She leaned forward, picking up the lead of the rope, and tugged it tight to her chest. Eric was nearly launched off his feet as he spun towards the burly female. She was a head taller than he, with dark skin covered in tattoos and scars. Her hair was a mess of matted braids and curls that spilled down around her face. She leered at him with tiny golden eyes as a frown pulled her mouth down around her two tusks. "You look familiar." Rossi reached out and pulled his face towards hers. The black hair with a shock of white, those blue eyes and long ears. Obviously not a full-blooded elf. He didn't have the elongated features, so likely part human. "It's been a long time since I've seen one of your kind. Tell me, half-breed." She thumbed the collar of his Hawaiian shirt and scoffed. What idiot would be marching around in these woods without proper gear? "What are you doing in this forest, and in the company of such a small dwarf?" The ogre, tired of waiting, leaned over and plucked up the smallest human in his massive hand, shoving the hellhound out of the way.
"Can eat now?" "Stop! You can't eat us!" Eric put his hands up, taking a slight step back. Rossi pinched the flesh of his forearm. "Not that there's much of you to go around, but why shouldn't I let my troops enjoy a nice elfling stew?" Eric blanched. Because I'm really important?" Rossi raised an incredulous eyebrow. "Oh, I hadn't realized I was in the presence of greatness." A chorus of laughter erupted around the camp. "In that case, we shall use only the finest ingredients when cooking you." "No, you don't understand. I'm the—" Evan managed to get his mouth free of the ogre's grasp. "Dude, stop talking!" Akaz clasped his hands on either side of the tiny merc's face, smushing his mouth closed. Rossi's eyes bored into Eric's threateningly. "Out here, we don't care who you are." Eric gulped. "But I'm the Lost King." Evan groaned beneath Akaz's pungent grip. "The king?" Rossi's face fell in surprise. She fished around her money pouch and withdrew a silver coin. A smile slowly pulled at her lips as she compared the two. "I knew you looked familiar." Eric tried to straighten his back, but the lead prevented him from getting all the way into a commanding pose. "Yes, that is who I am." There was no going back now. He would just have to bluff his way out. He licked his lips and plowed on. "Release us and leave us unharmed, or I will unleash upon you the untold hordes of my undead minions, and then force your corpses to join their ranks." The entire camp broke into a cacophony of worried muttering and panic. The orcs dropped their sharpening stones, and the gnolls let out barks of fear. "Let him go! Eat him quickly! I don't want to be undead!" "Silence!" Rossi put up her hand, demanding order in her camp. There was something about this half-breed that had her doubting everything he said. She licked one of her tusks in a thoughtful manner before the smile returned to her face. "Call them, then." A pregnant pause stagnated the air as a hush washed over the camp. Eric felt a pit drop in his stomach as he looked around. The crackling fire could do little to hide the quaver in his voice. "What?" The general reached out and tugged against the elf's brightly colored floral cloak. "If you were the king from the tales of my youth, we'd already be dead." Her smile only widened. "The way I see it, you must have lost your powers. So, call them. Prove me wrong." A lesser man would have crumpled beneath her challenge. And being a lesser man, Eric was finding it very difficult not to do so. It was too late to back out now. He licked his lips again and leveled his gaze on the general.
Rise, my minions! Come unto me!
A moment passed, but only silence echoed his words. Not that he really expected anything else. A flicker of fear traveled down his spine as he heard the general give a bark of a laugh. She relinquished her grip on the bindings and turned to her camp. "String him up! Tomorrow we ride for the Bandit Queen!" She turned back to the elf and lowered her voice. "I guess the forest really does provide." Eric swallowed hard and looked into those piercing eyes.
Does this mean you aren't going to eat us?
Rossi's eyes flicked up to Evan. "Oh, right, the miniature dwarf." The general smirked. "Akaz, as reward for bringing us the lost king, you may keep the small one all for yourself." Evan gave an angry protest from behind the imp's elongated fingers. He locked eyes with Eric, who mouthed him a silent apology. Despite the looming threat of being something's dinner, all he could think about was his forgotten blade, alone in the forest. A blood-curdling scream rose from the group of kobolds near the edge of camp, followed by a long, wispy groan that rolled across the clearing like a foul miasma. Everybody froze, unsure of what they had just heard. But as a gaunt figure in ragged leathers shambled out from the shadows, a palpable fear erupted through the camp. What had been a hardened military force moments before was now a screaming mass of animals clambering over one another out of fear as they tore off into the woods in opposite directions. Even the pale ogre dropped its prize as his impish companion tugged furiously at its ear to spur it to greater speeds. Rossi grabbed the elf by the collar of his floral shirt and pulled him in close. She drew a jagged saber from her side and raised it high in the air. "Anyone who flees will feed the soil of our fields with their corpse before the night is through. I so swear it. Rally to me!" It appeared as though not many at her camp shared in her confidence, however. After the initial wave of deserters had diffused into the forest, there was only a dozen or so bandits left. Rossi turned back to the elf, her gaze flickering between his blue eyes and the creature that was wandering out from between the trees. "One shambling corpse is hardly a horde. I still believe this to be a bluff." The undead figure continued its way toward them, parting her troops like water to oil. Something massive burst through the trees, following on the heels of the undead. A slim, red-haired man sauntered in closely behind. He looked around before his face lit up with recognition. "Ah, there you are, your majesty." Atlas stepped into the orange glow of the firelight, a broad smile cresting his face. "And I see the bandits have saved me the trouble of recapturing you." He gave a small bow of gratitude to the orc leader. "My eternal thanks for the assistance. Now, if you'll be so kind to hand him over, I'll be out of your hair and off to collect me bounty." Barry fell in line beside his friend, shaking leaves and small branches out of his fur. After noticing all the spears, pikes, and crossbows turning to point in their direction, he gave his friend a worried nudge with his head. "Oh, shush! I told you we would find them if we just followed Bob there." Atlas returned his gaze to the orc female and snapped his fingers in her direction, sending out faint sparks. "You have what's mine."
Rossi pulled the elf closer to her and leveled her sword towards the newcomers.
Why would we hand him over to you? We found him.
No. See, I captured him first, so I get the bounty. Now, if and you please.
He flexed his hand open and closed, gesturing for her to relinquish the lead.
Piss off, mage. Mage?
Atlas rolled up his sleeves, tucking them into themselves, and bent over to pluck a lengthy twig up off the ground.
I'm no common mage. You, madam, are addressing a fully-fledged arcanist.
He plunged the end of his stick into the ground and began scribbling in the dirt. The general pushed her prisoner to the side and drew another rusty sword. She flipped them both in her hands, leveling them at the intruder.
Then I guess we'll just have to settle this the old-fashioned way.
At the realization of his sudden freedom, Eric thought of bolting from the camp. But something nagged at him, telling him to stay put. It might have been because they were surrounded by heavily armed bandits, or it could have been his piqued interest to see what the charlatan would do. Either way, his situation was unlikely to improve.
Hurry up and get me out of here!
To his dismay, however, Bob was the only one listening and began to amble faster in his direction.
I grow weary of this.
Rossi lowered her blades, primed for attack, and began to sprint towards the mage. Instead, she pitched forward and face-planted the dirt with a cry of pain as a tiny knife sank into her ankle. Evan pulled his knife free and leapt back, standing guard over the loose lead that bound his friend.
Who's next?
Atlas looked up with a manic grin as he leaned over and pressed his palm into the middle of the rune he had just etched.
Behold your doom!
A little ball of glowing white light shot up out of the earth. As all eyes spun towards the bright sphere, he glanced over to the fake king and offered him a knowing wink before spinning around. Realization hit Eric and he spun, diving for the tiny merc. He shoved Evan into the ground, smothering him against the dirt as an impossibly bright supernova of light erupted around them. Even through clenched eyes, his vision popped with vivid colors. Agonized screams of pain exploded around them, including whines and howls from the hellhound. Something cold grasped Eric by the back of his shirt and hauled him to his feet. He spun to see Bob, gesturing towards the edge of camp, gently ushering him out to the woods. Atlas gave a mirthful whoop of laughter and climbed onto the back of Barry.
Works every time. Let's get our prize and get out of here.
Barry grunted his approval and barreled towards the Nada King. Rossi got to her feet, snarling as she brushed dirt out of her eyes. She looked around at her small army writhing in agony and spun, just in time, to dive out of the way of the charging bear. Atlas leaned to the side as Barry bolted past Eric and managed to haul him up roughly across the bear's back. Evan, not wanting to be left behind, reached out and snagged a hold of the rope just in time, then began hauling himself up Barry's side. Rossi dropped her swords and dove for a crossbow, rolling to one knee. She leveled her weapon and took aim. The bolts soared towards the group as they disappeared into the tree line. And just like that, they were gone. Rossi screamed in rage and snapped the crossbow in half. She limped over and retrieved her swords. This would not be the end of it. She would find and slaughter the mage, feed the bear to her hellhound, and spit roast the dwarf for stabbing her. The Lost King was too great a prize to let slip away so easily. But first, she would have to see to the rest of her troops, and then kill the deserters. She let out a tired groan as she pulled Drez onto his feet. It was going to be a long night. As the general stalked into her tent to find something to bandage her ankle, Bob slowly turned on the spot and began ambling toward the tree line, following an unseen trail and disappearing into the woods. Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
What? No! Akos wasn't running away! Akos saw enemy in the forest, went to fight!
Don't lie to me, Akos. I should kill you where you stand for abandoning me.
No, Akos good fighter. Akos fine king once already. Do it again.
Damn it, Akos. Get down here and let me...
Wait. If Akos dead, who ride on Grunch? Grunch no like other imps.
Is this true, Grunch?
Akos, friend.
And if I was to replace your friend?
Orc lady, her friend, Grunch ate Orc lady.
Oh, in that case, good work spotting the bad guy in the forest. Back to work, both of you.